What do you do when a friend of yours misses church? What do you do when a family member of yours misses church? How do you navigate the situation like that? Do you say nothing? Do you say something? Do you come on? Do you have a passive approach? Do you have an approach that's too strong? It's certainly something that's come up in conversations. In how do you navigate the uncomfortable, awkward situation, and especially when the last video I made was the 27 reasons to miss church. Today's video is about being on the opposite side of that conversation. Maybe you're not the one person. Maybe you didn't miss church, but you have a friend of yours or a family member of yours, and they miss church. It's common enough. Again, if you think about the number of services that any one church can have, even a more modest church is meeting only once a week, maybe only on even Sundays. That's still 52 meetings in a year, 104 meetings in 2 years, over 150 in 3 years. And so a missing of the meeting is bound to happen. Now, what do you do and what do those conversations look like when you have somebody in your circle who does miss? So I figured we start in the book of Ecclesiastes. There's a great passage that I think if you took this principle and you applied it to a number of areas of your life, it would serve you and it would help you. So we're going to go to Ecclesiastes chapter 7, and we'll pick it up in verse 17. It does tell us, it says, do not be over wicked, and do not be a fool. Why die before your time? It is good to grasp the one and not let go of the other. Whoever fears God will avoid all extremes. Whoever fears God will avoid all extremes. What does that one mean? Is that there is a human tendency to get extreme. So one thing that I try to do when it comes to conversations around helping somebody, helping or even mentoring other people, is if you understand that the man of God or even the woman of God is to avoid these extremes. If you can paint the picture of what the tail ends of the extremes are, it's likely it's going to help you out. So even as we talk about this example, let's discuss the two extremes, and then we'll apply Ecclesiastes chapter 7 to these two extremes. We'll aim to avoid those. So if somebody missed church, maybe we'll paint the opposite ends of the extreme. If there's a five-point scale on this example, arbitrary 5-point, but let's say a one. Let's say that's somebody with a water gun, right? It's something that's very, very minimal effort as far as the liquid coming out. A very, very small, tiny dollar store water gun, and that's the person. Maybe that's almost doing nothing. Maybe even doing nothing. And the opposite end of that extreme is if you have water gun on one end, maybe it's on the opposite end. It's the fire hose. They're bringing out all of the power and ammunition. This is the person. Again, this is the most intense conversation of your life. So if you think about these two extremes, one of them is the water gun, or it's the least intense, and you think about the most intense is the fire hose. And you think about this situation again, you think about the relevant passages, maybe the Hebrews chapter 10 passage that this says to not give up meeting. Somebody who misses one service hasn't necessarily given up meeting. And by the way, they might have had a really good reason for what they were doing instead of being at that service. I don't know, but that's why if you're able to label the extremes, you're able to navigate, okay, what's the best way to even approach a situation like this? Naturally, um, my nephew and my nephew and niece are watching. Tell them I said hello. Hey Jackson and hey Mila. What are they doing up so late? But James chapter 1, and see, all the more reason for me to, to teach some of these principles. So James chapter 1 tells us to be quick to listen and slow to speak. So if somebody's missing church, maybe before I make any assumptions, before I assume I know what they were doing, what they were prioritizing, before I make any kind of weird assumptions, maybe I just listen. I take some time to listen. Maybe what helps you to be quick to listen is to ask questions to show that you care. Ask questions to show that you care, because on these extremes, the one extreme, again, I said the water gun versus the fire hose. The water gun, the bad thing about the water gun in this example, maybe it's the kind of person who would say nothing or do nothing, right? But if you think about these two extremes, if we're supposed to avoid these, maybe the say nothing, do nothing is off, and the overly intense is off. But we can see why overly intense. Nobody wants to be micromanaged. Nobody wants to be smothered in the Lord. Nobody wants an extra somebody who's overbearing, exasperating, providing unnecessary pressure to them. Nobody wants that. But also, nobody wants to feel abandoned. Nobody wants to feel forgotten. Being a part of a number of organizations in my lifetime, sometimes I would lean in that direction where, hey, I don't want to be the micromanager. I've certainly been the micromanager, and even as I've worked in my professional career. And then I said, you know what? That's not helpful. That's not what builds people up. That's not what shows trust. But I've also gone to that other extreme where I would say very little and say nothing. But that other extreme also communicates something. It could communicate, again, that your lack of presence wasn't even noticed. And one of the reasons that people leave organizations, I remember when I was in BNI, we had a training about attendance. And one of the reasons that one of the trainings in this business networking organization, one of the principles I thought was so fascinating, it was one of the reasons people leave the organization because they feel like they're not actually making a difference, that nobody would notice if I wasn't here. Nobody would notice if I wasn't here. But if church is supposed to be the place where we are representing Jesus. We're representing love, right? God is love. We're representing God. Then this is not one of those places where we want to go, hey, if you didn't come, nobody would notice. In fact, when we study the scriptures, go look at the parable that Jesus told in Luke chapter 15. In that text, it was the shepherd who notices every single one of the 100 sheep. Every single one. When one strayed away, if he had 100, if one strayed away, he noticed. And he took action. So we certainly do not want to be we say we don't want to be the overly intense, how dare you, what's wrong with you, raising our voices, being condescending. No, we don't want that. But we also don't want I didn't even notice you were gone. We want to be the kind of shepherds who notice people are gone. And you think about other examples like this, when you talk about these extremes, and there are times when you raise that intensity up, right? The example that always comes to me is if there was a child in the street and there was a vehicle speeding down the street, and there's a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old in the street, that's one of the most appropriate times to move to a level 5 and to speak with the most intensity, to yell at the top of your lungs, to get that child's attention, to save that child. There's a time and a place for intensity. And you know what the scriptures tell us? I think the scriptures give us a lot of guidance in this. So this is one of the reasons I believe the Christians have an advantage, because you have this book that equips you for all of life. 2 Timothy chapter 4 tells us to preach the word. Actually, let me go ahead and pull it up on the screen. We'll go ahead and pull it up together. 2 Timothy chapter 4 tells us, preach the word. Be prepared in season and out of season. Correct, rebuke, and encourage with great patience and careful instruction. You did catch that right, with great patience and careful instruction. Great patience. When you preach that word, great patience and careful instruction. You also caught that it said correct, rebuke, and encourage. That means it's not only rebuking, it's not only correcting, but it's also encouragement. So you figure out which part of the word you might be using in the conversation, because again, you're quick to listen so you could understand, right? Before you're trying to be understood, you seek to understand the situation. I've spoken before about it's like you're seeing the soil. What does the soil need? And you modify your approach based on the soil. 1 Thessalonians 5 tells us something similar. Let's go to that text as well. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 tells us, it's one of my favorite passages, but there's different strokes for different folks. And verse 14 tells us, and we urge you, brothers and sisters, warn those who are idle and disruptive, encourage the disheartened, help the weak, be patient with everyone. You see that? There's different approaches based on the person. It's not just one approach for everyone. It's not one size fits all. And sometimes there's that tendency when your basic tool is a hammer, you tend to see everything as a nail, and you think that's the one approach, whether it's rebuke or, again, maybe it's overly passive. Yet, this scripture tells us there's different strokes for different folks, depending on where people are or where they're at. You modify your approach. Jude tells us, it's the second last book of the Bible, tells us to be merciful to those who doubt. So again, you think, okay, but they're doubt. Maybe they're not. They didn't come to church because there's some kind of doubt going on. So what's your response? And I'm going to give you a story at the end of this video that I think is one of the most powerful things you can do for someone who misses church. But we'll save that for the end. So you actually got to stay. You actually got to rock with me to the end to catch that piece of it. People don't want to be micromanaged. People don't want to be abandoned. People don't want to be smothered in accountability. People don't want to feel like their presence doesn't make a difference. So the question is, what do people want? John chapter 13, Jesus told us that if you want people to actually know you're his followers, you're his disciples, you love them. People everywhere want love. And if you wanted to break down love a little bit further, 1 Corinthians 13 tells us that love is patient, love is kind. Let's just stay with those two concepts, love, kindness and patience. Because sometimes you go, I know people who don't want love. Well, it's interesting when you take this patience and kindness and you also think through their opposites or the antithetical concepts of patience and kindness. The opposite of patience is annoyance, according to the Proverbs that contrast patience and annoyance. I don't know anybody who prefers the people around them to get annoyed toward them. I don't know anybody who's like that. Maybe you do. I haven't met anybody. I'm 37 years old. Haven't met anybody who prefers to have people annoyed at them as opposed to patient with them. And then what about kindness? What's the opposite of kindness? Rudeness. I I don't know anybody who prefers the people around them to be rude toward them. I don't know anybody who's wired that way, or who operates in that way. In fact, it's more of the opposite, where people prefer kindness. People prefer the patience. So what do people want? They don't want to be smothered with accountability. But what I'm finding interesting, even with a number of my friends who aren't even coming to the same church as me anymore, how many of them, especially the men. Let me say. And then again, I don't have a bunch of interaction with women, but the men, fascinating to me is people have told me, seemingly more now than ever, they want more accountability. They want more involvement. When I've asked them, how can I serve them? How can I show before them? They've asked for more accountability and more spurring them on toward love and good deeds, not less. But what do people want? They want love. They want patience. They don't want annoyance. They want kindness. They don't want rudeness. 1 Peter chapter 2 tells us they want, show people the proper respect. People want respect. I don't know anybody who doesn't want respect. Romans chapter 12 tells us to honor one another above ourselves. So what if you just took those three? Love, which is, we'll just take two pieces of the subcategories of love, which is patience and kindness. Then you have respect and honor. Can you take those with you into the conversation? As you see what's happening with them, you take kindness, patience, respect, and honor. If you really want to do some homework, go to Ephesians chapter 4. It says, be completely humble and gentle. Now we have 6 qualities you're taking into that conversation. Sounds a whole lot like Colossians chapter 3 that tells us to clothe ourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. The clothes that the Christian is supposed to have on. Sometimes we leave the clothes to the side when we go into some of these conversations, but compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. I mean, what more could you want right there? Back to that parable I referenced earlier, the Luke chapter 15, the shepherd who knows all 100 of his sheep. He knows when one goes astray, that he takes action. And it's not one less mouth to feed. No. It's, I'm going to get personally involved. I'm going to use my efforts, my energy. I'm going to put the work in. I'm going to put the time in. I'm going to sacrifice to make sure that one that got away is taken care of. And one of the most important lessons, I think in all of life, because criticism can be so crippling, is there's a criticism that I've learned to be okay with. It's the criticism that comes from trying. I could deal with that criticism. Especially when it comes to my personal walk with God. At the end, right? When we see, go look at the parable of the talents in Matthew chapter 25, or the parable of the bags of gold. And the good and faithful servants were the ones who tried. That last wicked and lazy servant was the one who didn't try. So for me, I'm going to be okay trying, making effort, putting myself out there. Sometimes I talk about it's when you make an effort and you try to help people, or you try to lead, or you try to make an impact. It's sometimes I feel like it's like you're stepping on stage with a little bit of a bullseye because you receive more criticism than anybody else. I know when I've done the most for God, when I stepped out the most on faith, when I've tried to do things with courage in mind, there's also, with courage comes criticism. But if I want to be a coward, I could avoid a whole lot of criticism, except the criticism that comes from God, because I could be a coward, wicked, lazy servant who does not use my time, talent, and treasure to glorify God. But let me wrap this video up because I had a situation like this before I actually even got baptized. So we're talking over 20 years ago. I remember there was a situation, it's a church that I still go to now, and I remember I overslept Sunday morning, missed church. And then later that afternoon, one of the guys who had been inviting me to church, he told me, or actually he called me. So it's Sunday afternoon. I overslept, slept through the service. I see him calling me. And it's Pedro who was on my basketball team in high school. And I'm 16, 17 years old. And so I see Pedro calling me, and I already know he's gonna get after me. He's gonna challenge me for oversleeping. He's gonna get mad and get upset. He's gonna be overly intense. But even though I knew he was gonna do that, I went ahead and picked up the phone, and it was one of the most powerful phone calls I'd ever have, because I was so convinced he was going to get after me that when he called me to say, hey, I was thinking about getting some guys together to play basketball later, and I wanted to see if you wanted to come. And it's such a moving, it seems so simple, right? He called me knowing that I missed church earlier that morning. And instead of scolding me, instead of getting in trouble, again, he's coming with some intensity, he actually didn't even bring it up, but instead offered what I would say the love of quality time. Of, hey, let's go do something that both of us like to do together. Let's get some people together and go do this thing. And isn't it crazy that over 20 years later, that's the story I'm telling today when I miss church? And it's an example of the love that I was talking about earlier that we all want, the kindness, the patience. And it's funny because even like since then, I've missed so few services. Again, whenever I'm missing, there's something else that I'm trying to do to glorify God. But Pedro's example just inspires me. Somebody who made the phone call and offered to spend time with me, independent that I had missed church. It's so moving. And so anyway, I hope as you go into these conversations that you always consider grace and truth, and you speak to build people up so that people know they're loved, they're honored and respected by you because you actually care. So you're actually having the conversations. You're not avoiding them. You're trying not to be awkward, but sometimes it is. Yeah, confrontation, having conversation about these things can be. And I'm going to be okay with that. I'm gonna be okay with the awkwardness. I'm gonna be okay. Again, I'll do a whole video on like even what it actually means to be weird. And there's a weird amount of success that I want. There's a weird amount of godliness that I want because sometimes you just don't see that. Anyway, hope that served you. If it helped you, feel free to share it with somebody else. And we'll see you on the next video.